I'll give a brief introduction and then hand the floor to Professor Bharat Bhaskar, Director IIMA Ahmedabad, who will be giving the opening remarks. Dr. Francisca is the Chief Economist for the South Asia region of the World Bank. In her, she leads the research program on key economic policy issues, South Asia to inform the policy debate and World Bank lending. In her previous position, she has led 19 editions of the Global Economic Prospects Report, which is a flagship publication of the World Bank. She has had a stellar career across international financial institutions, including the International Monetary Fund, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and the World Bank. Her research has covered a wide range of topics, including global debt, growth, financial crisis, inflation, fiscal multipliers, financial development, and informal labor markets, among other topical issues. She has a PhD from the University of Toronto. I'm also happy to mention that this is not the first time that Dr. Francisca is interacting with IIMA students. He has given a virtual lecture talk to PGP students a few years back, which was very well appreciated and led to interesting discussions. It's really great that she is able to visit IIMA Ahmedabad in person today. Dr. is a lead economist for the South Asia Bank. He has worked on many interesting research topics, such as firm productivity, innovation, labor, and environmental issues, among others. He has a PhD at Yale University. With this brief introduction, I now invite Professor Bharat Bhaskar, Director IIMA Ahmedabad, to present mementos to the speakers. I now request Professor Bhaskar to give the opening remarks.
Thank you for organizing this seminar for our community at IIM Ahmedabad. I take great pleasure in welcoming Dr. Francisca Onsals, Chief Economist of South Asia, Chief Economist for South Asia at World Bank, and Dr. Siddharth Sharma, who is a lead economist at the World Bank. They will be presenting, of course, their report, but prior to that, I should say that as the largest economy of South Asia, accounting for almost 75% of the GDP of the region, we are the major contributor of the economic activity in this region. In a year where most countries in the world are facing various challenges, both global and domestic, India is projected to achieve the highest GDP growth rate of 6.3 in 23-24. Among all major economies in 2023, according to the latest IMF estimate in October, although India's growth has shown down a little from 7.2%, but yet we remain one of the fastest growing country in the world. India is also expected to contribute to thrive in the medium term. It is projected to overtake Germany and Japan to become the third largest economy by 27-28, according to the IMF, improving upon its current position from fifth economy which we hold today. While other countries including China are rapidly aging, India is benefiting from favorable demographics, large working age population, and rise in incomes and expansion of the consumer base makes India the attractive destination for both international and domestic investment. India has been receiving strong FDI and portfolio investment inflows in recent times. The inclusion of Indian bonds in the JP Morgan Government Bond Index for the emerging markets is likely to further give boost to inflows to India's debt market. As multinational companies look to de-risk their exposure to China and diversify their production and supply chains as part of China Plus One strategy, this has created opportunity for India. Supportive government policies, including the production-linked incentives scheme, are also creating a conducive environment for manufacturing in India. The government has also increased its capital expenditure outlay in amount of Indian rupees 10 trillion during financial year 23-24, which is 33% above the financial year 22-23. For instance, Foxconn, the largest contract manufacturer for Apple, has committed to invest more than $25 billion across Tamil Nadu, Telangana and Karnataka, and is rapidly scaling production. In this last financial year, Apple manufactures 7% of its global phone supply in India and has planned to increase it to 18% in financial year 24-25, as per the Bank of America report. iPhone exports from India, valued at more than $5 billion, accounted for nearly half of the overall mobile phone exports from India in financial year 22-23. India is also receiving significant investment across several sectors, including semiconductor technologies, Micron, Foxconn, S3 Micro, also the cloud computing led by Amazon, aircraft components and logistics by Boeing, communication and internet technologies by Cisco are among many others who are actually looking to India for major investments. Under India's recent presidency of G20, 28 countries, including all the observer as well as the member countries, agreed on doubling the pace of energy efficiency by 2030. India aims to reach net zero emission by 2070 and meet 50% of the electricity requirement from renewable energy sources by 2030. India has experienced a recent surge in investment related to renewable, green energies and energy storage projects. For instance, Petronas Hydrogen, a Malaysian company, has committed to invest 3 to 3.8 billion in India to set up a green hydrogen plant. A joint venture of Total Energies France and Adani Group India is also set to invest 5 billion in the green hydrogen project. Ola Electric is setting up India's largest giga factory in Tamil Nadu to manufacture rechargeable batteries for electric vehicles market. India is seeing a rapid adoption of EV, although from a relatively very low base. The cumulative EV sales, including 2, 3 and 4 wheelers in India, has crossed 1 million in first 3 quarters of 23, and number of registered EVs have grown to about 2.8 million. The share of EV sales in passenger and light commercial vehicle sales in India was only 1.1%, substantially lower than 27.1% for China, as per recent S&P report, suggesting EV adoption in India needs to accelerate further. The presentation by World Bank team comes at an opportune time for India, also for broader South Asian market. Some of our neighboring countries, Bangladesh, Pakistan and Sri Lanka, have faced balance of payment difficulties and challenges related to sovereign debt in recent years. I and the audience eagerly look forward to your report today and your analysis which you are doing. I now invite Francisca and Siddharth to present the South Asia's economic prospects and implication on ongoing energy transition on the firms. Thank you. Please come.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. Can you hear me? I guess you can hear me anyways, no? So it's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you very much. And I recognize this room, I think, unless all your rooms look similar. I do remember a room like this from several years ago. So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. You will get the 30-minute version of this 150-page report, so I encourage you to download it for more details. But you will get the very condensed version of this, all the main highlights now. Siddharth and I were going to structure our remarks around 4 questions. First, what's the outlook for the South Asia region? And the professor is right, it's 75% of the region is India. So you would think that everything in the region is pretty much driven by India, but it's actually surprising how different the countries are in their structural features, and yet how similar their prospects are, how similar many of their challenges are as well. The second question focuses on one particular risk that is common across the region, and that's fiscal challenges. They are really exceptionally high in this region, and not just in India, across the region. So the usual answer, the silver bullet to solve fiscal risk is usually growth. The problem is, of course, how do you generate growth? No? But actually, there's one win-win solution that we will show, Siddharth will go into in detail, which is energy-efficient investment. And the energy transition is a great opportunity to improve growth, but it will also have labor market impacts. And there are some nice facts in there that may be of interest for those of you who will soon be looking for a job, which Siddharth will show you in the last question, how the energy transition is going to affect labor markets. So let's start with the outlook. Professor is right, the outlook in India is better, or not just in India, actually across the region, the outlook is better, with few exceptions, than in the rest of the emerging world. Because this is not an easy world to operate in. This is not an easy global environment. You can see in the chart on the left the PMIs, the Purchasing Managers surveys. You can see already for several months, the manufacturing sector has been contracting globally. Trade has been very weak. Now, for a long time, services has held up global economic activity, global growth, but even that is petering out now. So there's been weakness, pronounced weakness in global trade and global GDP growth. In the euro area, there's some concern about the euro area tipping into a global recession. China's growth has been slowing sharply. So there's been weakness just about everywhere. At the same time, interest rates have risen sharply. You can see here in advanced economies, this is of course the Fed and the ECB rate rises that have been driving it up. But in addition, there's been an even steeper increase in financial tightening, in financial conditions in emerging markets and developing economies that they're struggling with. And in many countries, an exceptionally large number of countries, this has already led to debt distress. And we'll get to that in the second question. Now, against this difficult backdrop, is right, the region is doing surprisingly well. You can see here the growth forecast for 2023 this year, but that's pretty much water under the bridge. But also for 2024 and 25, the golden diamonds are growth forecasts for South Asia. The bars show you the growth forecast for all the other regions. Now, the World Bank has 6 of those. That's a lot of regions, more than some other international financial institutions. But you can see that South Asia is doing much better than any other emerging market and developing economy region. We expect growth of 5.8%. That is a slowdown from the 8.2% last year, but it is better than anywhere else. And of course, in part, it reflects the difficult global environment. Same thing for 2024, same thing for 2025. This region is more resilient than others. But, there's a but. There's always a catch, right, when you hear good news. These golden bars, these growth prospects for 2024 and 25 are a slowdown from pre-pandemic levels. And that's what this chart in the center shows you. It shows you for each of the countries in the region where we have data. Afghanistan, we don't have data. For each of the countries we have data for, it shows you the range of GDP growth forecasts we expect for 2024, next couple of years, basically, 24 and 25. And it compares against the growth rates, the averages before the pandemic. You can see everywhere, things are not as good as before the pandemic. Growth is much lower than before the pandemic. So that's one way, that's one of the caveats. There is another caveat. Growth is much less than what is needed for each country's government's own goals to be met. So here you see the goals for each country. I think all these countries other than Pakistan have the goal to achieve high income status, including India, sometime in this generation, 2030, 2040, it depends a bit on the country. So to make it simple and actually easier than many of the government goals to achieve, we assume by 2050, each of these countries, what would it need for each of these countries to achieve high income status? That's the golden diamonds. For Pakistan, the relevant one is the red bar, which is upper middle income status by around 2050. You can see nowhere is growth going to be enough? The blue bars here, our current growth forecast, nowhere is it going to be enough to achieve the government's goals. Yeah, so growth is good compared to others. It's not good compared to what the region is used to, or compared to what the governments want to achieve. And that's if nothing goes wrong. There are a number of risks that can go wrong. Take, for example, natural disasters. This region is more susceptible to natural disasters than most other regions. Yeah. Most of the countries in the region are in the upper quartile by Notre Dame University's Index of Climate Vulnerability. India is just on the cusp, it's almost in the upper quartile. Most of the countries in the region are among the most vulnerable emerging markets and developing economies in the world to climate disasters. And this is just one way of showing it. Over the past 10 years, 60 million people in the region were affected by climate disasters in some form or other. Could be a flood, a drought, a cyclone, climate disaster. That's 60 million people on average per year. Of course, it's never on average per year. No, it doesn't come every year. It happens once every 5 years in massive numbers that are really difficult to manage. If it was every year 60 million people, you could plan. The problem is you can't plan. These things are massive 1 year and then 4 years nothing. And it's more than any other emerging market and developing economy region. Both in absolute numbers, no surprise there, because there are a lot of people here, but also in percent of GDP. That's one risk. Climate risks just keep happening. They just keep derailing growth outlooks. Growth, not just outlooks. We don't really put these into our growth forecast. There's always a downside risk to our forecast, especially in this region. The other risk is external. I showed you already the external environment is difficult. It could become a lot more difficult. One risk in particular stands out, that the slowdown in China is bigger than we currently expect. That this real estate sector that's already struggling will struggle even more, that we will see more bankruptcies, that perhaps growth could be as low as 2.5% below the baseline. Currently, we expect about 4.5% growth in China in 2024. Imagine it's another 2.5 percentage points less, so it's about 2%. That is very, very low for China. That is on par with the pandemic. So this would really be a crisis in real estate markets that then triggers a fiscal response by the authorities, and you'd have a rebound in 25. Now, what that would do to South Asian GDP growth would be to reduce growth by another 0.5 percentage point. That is less than in other regions. It's about half the impact of other regions. Why? Because this region is quite closed. It's really, as an approximation, when we think of one region or how this region stands out, South Asia stands out amongst other emerging market and developing economies, we think of it as a largely closed region. And the reason is in good measure restrictions. Here you see import and export restrictions. Here you see foreign currency restrictions. What you don't see is capital import and capital flow restrictions, inflow and outflow restrictions. The charts don't look that different. You can see that every one of the big countries in the region has above average import restrictions. Yes, India has unwound many of them, but it's still above average. And India is also the country that has above average export restrictions. This data lags, so this is 2022 data. Now, several countries have faced balance of payments pressures in the last couple of years, and what have they done? First thing to do is to raise foreign currency restrictions. That temporarily reduces the pressure on balance of payments and foreign currency markets, but what it also does, and this, remember, this is on top of above average capital inflow and capital outflow restrictions in these countries. So this comes on top of already more restrictive policies. And it did take some of the, it took some of the pressures off foreign currency markets in the short term, but in the long term, of course, in Nepal, suddenly there were a bunch of remittances that used to come through formal channels, they came through informal channels. So it made it worse. In Bangladesh, too, some of the pressures are now being felt in investment. In investment because it's hard to import things. And that is in part accounts for the weakness in private sector investment in the region. So this is the chart on the left. Here the region is actually better than most other regions. It's difficult to find data on private investment, but we do manage to find it for most of the big countries in this region. So hats off to the statisticians here. But you can see the weakness in private investment in all of these the biggest countries in the region. The blue bars shows you the latest annual average growth rates in private investment. And you see the pre-pandemic average. Everywhere there has been a slowdown in private investment growth. Private investment is really struggling. And I'm sure you've seen a lot of the anecdotes as well, that private investors are complaining that they can't find inputs, it's difficult to finance. You see it anecdotally in the press, you also see it in the data. Private investment is really struggling in just about every country we can find data for. There's real weakness in private investment. What governments have done, they've offset some of this with massive public investment, India being one of them. Public investment growth has been very, very strong. In fact, it's been one of the biggest drivers of that above average GDP growth compared to other emerging markets and developing economies that I showed you in just a couple of slides ago. So public investment growth has been well above other emerging markets and developing economies. It's been the driver of GDP growth in this region, certainly in India, in Bangladesh, but Bhutan. Bhutan is small. Elsewhere, in Pakistan and Nepal, of course, is fiscal pressures. No? It's been negative even. And the question now is, for the outlook, there's no reason to expect this to improve, but there's a lot of reason to expect that to deteriorate, because fiscal positions in the regions are very weak. All the countries in the region share fiscal challenges, and these are the main ones. This slide sort of captures the fiscal problem in the region, across the region, not just the average or India, across the region. We deliberately use unweighted average because we don't want to just be showing you charts of India. No, every weighted average will just be India. So this is deliberately unweighted averages. You see the government debt. Government debt is 86% of GDP. It's the highest of any emerging market and developing economy region. Compared to in other emerging markets and developing economies, average 60% of GDP. Not only is it higher than others, it's also grown faster than others. This is a high debt region. And one of the reasons is revenue weakness. This is the thing that really stands out in this region. There are very few other regions that have so systematically weak government revenues. Here's the EMDE average of government revenues to GDP ratios. Sri Lanka and Bangladesh have less than 10%. That is really extraordinary. Those are extraordinarily low numbers. India also has almost 10 percentage points of GDP lower revenues, government revenues, than the EMDE average. Nepal also less. Maldives less. Bhutan is only higher because of a lot of official aid inflows. This region across the board has a revenue problem. Governments struggle to collect revenues. It's very difficult to collect revenues here. And of course, then it's very difficult to run a government if you have such low revenues. Then public service quality deteriorates. It's hard to run a government on 10% of GDP. It's also harder than elsewhere to run it on 20% of GDP of revenues. And some countries are already in outright debt distress. And this is where a lot of the analytical work in this edition went to, that was not related to green growth, what Siddharth will show you. Perhaps it's no surprise that a number of countries in this region are already in debt distress. Yeah, so the 3 countries are already rated by Moody's as in or near debt distress. Because this is what happens. We are exactly at this point in the global economic cycle where debt distress happens. And that's what we show you in the chart here on the left. We gather 177 debt defaults, domestic and external, from 2 big papers in the literature. Anyone who knows that literature will know Asonuma and Trebesh 2016, and Erce, Malucci, and Piccarelli 2022. So we find 177 debt defaults for 54 emerging markets and developing economies. And we just check, when did they happen? As it turns out, they really bunch around certain times in a global business cycle, at certain times and certain countries. The certain times are the end of Fed tightening cycles. 90% of these debt defaults that are kind of the state of the art in the literature, 90% happened around the end of Fed tightening cycles, kind of like now. More than 2/3 happen in countries that are above average, above median government debt. South Asia. Almost every country in South Asia. Yeah, so this is exactly the conjuncture at the moment that invites debt default. And the catch is that often debt default doesn't achieve what it's meant to do. Debt default is meant to improve government fiscal positions, government sustainability, debt sustainability. So it's supposed to reduce debt and it's supposed to reduce borrowing cost. Turns out that of these 177 debt defaults, more than half didn't do that. More than half of these debt defaults don't fix the problem. So again, here we use these debt defaults, the same thing, and we check whether 5 years later, government debt was lower or government borrowing costs were lower. And then we just count the number of episodes, count the number of defaults. Turns out that the gray bar here is 50%. It's a coin toss whether a debt default actually fixes the problem, reduces government debt 5 years out. Often it just reduces it 1 year out and then debt just starts going again. It's less than a coin toss. Whether it reduces, it's a little over a coin toss, but a third of them are still not fixing the problem. They don't reduce government debt. Now what you don't see here is what did achieve, what was associated with success. In a separate chart, when you look at the report, when you download it, you see that the factors that were associated with success, with successful debt default, so the white bits here in this chart, were threefold: growth, fiscal consolidation, and debt restructuring. So 9/10 of defaults that came with a domestic debt acceleration, domestic growth acceleration, 9/10 of those were good, were successful, compared to half of those that didn't have this growth acceleration. 2/3 of the debt defaults that came with a fiscal consolidation, with an improvement in the cyclically adjusted balance, were successful, compared to half that didn't have this improvement. And for the external debt defaults, 3/4 of those that had an above median default, the restructuring or haircut, were successful, compared to less than half of those that didn't have this restructuring. So what it needs to achieve success, i.e. to be here in the white bits, is growth, fiscal consolidation, and restructuring. Now some countries, and this speaks to India, some countries avoid default by relying on domestic borrowing. So here we put together, we show this by looking at all the government borrowing costs, government debt buildups, 105 of them in 114 emerging markets and developing economies, since 1979, I believe. So we take all the episodes in which government debt rose more than standard deviation above the average, and we check how did they end. Did they end in debt default? Yeah, of these, data for domestic debt and external debt is very, very patchy. So of these total debt defaults, we find about 40 domestic ones and about 50 external, not debt defaults, debt buildups. Found about 40 domestic debt buildups and about 50 external debt buildups. Turns out domestic government debt buildups have a 2% probability of ending in default. External debt buildups have a 6% probability of ending in default. So yes, one way of averting debt default is to just borrow domestically. Captive audience, no? Captive banking system, captive retail investors, captive investors. That helps with debt default, but there is a cost. And the cost is large and relates back to that chart I showed you on private investment. The cost is that it raises interest rates. It raises effective government borrowing costs, which drives up the whole yield curve. It drives up everyone's borrowing costs. And it reduces bank credit to government, it raises bank credit to government and reduces bank credit to the private sector. So it raises on average, so what you don't see in this chart here, it raises the average borrowing cost by 1 percentage point and reduces the maturity of debt by 2 years. It makes debt much more difficult to bear. Yeah? If you need to roll over more, you need to pay more for it, more debt service. And it raises the share of bank credit that goes to governments by 6 percentage points, leaving 6 percentage points less for the private sector. And you see exactly that happening in South Asia, which is here the blue bars compared to the golden bars in emerging markets. South Asia pays much more for government debt. i.e. everyone pays much more for their debt. The interest rate goes up for everyone. Yeah, the difference here in the blue bars for South Asia and the average emerging market. And government has, South Asia has much more credit to the government compared to the emerging market and developing economy average, i.e. less credit to the private sector. So it's not a slam dunk that government borrowing is the solution to debt distress. Actually, what is a slam dunk is growth, the silver bullet. Difficult thing is how to achieve it. And fiscal consolidation in some form or other. Now, the obvious thing in South Asia would, of course, be to raise revenues. A lot of countries have found that fiscal rules help them achieve this fiscal consolidation. And that's what we show here. For example, the countries that had strong fiscal rules had a much slower debt buildup from pre-pandemic rates. Yeah, the yellow diamonds here, compared to countries that had weak fiscal rules. A strong fiscal rule can really constrain the government debt buildup. It doesn't prevent it, but it can constrain it. Sorry, here this is always a legend that goes wrong every time we PDF this. This is the median this is the range for all the other countries. This is the range for South Asia. You can see here, yes, 4 of these countries in the region have actually fiscal rules. It's not like countries haven't thought of fiscal rules. The problem is they have very low strength. They tend to be not enforced, they tend to be in the future, so some promises for the future, who knows whether it will happen. They don't tend to be very well anchored in legislation. A really strong fiscal rule is in this constitution. Yeah, that's rare. But there are other arrangements around it that can strengthen the enforcement of fiscal rules. But South Asia's fiscal rules are actually well below the interquartile range in other emerging markets in developing economies. So South Asia, yes, 4 countries have fiscal rules, but they are much weaker than most other emerging markets in developing economies. And as it happens, they're also honored in the breach. So all of these countries actually happen to be the ones that have the highest debt in the region. And you can see here the rule, which is here the golden line, for example, for the budget balance. You could do a similar chart for debt, it would look very similar. But for the budget balance rule, you see here the budget balance rule is here. The outcome is there, the blue bars. None of these rules are being achieved. Now, sometimes there are good reasons not to achieve a rule, but then the strength of the rule determines how quickly you get back to it. And that's the bit that's missing in South Asia. So it probably needs more than the current arrangements to really bring fiscal policy back on track. I said multiple times that the silver bullet to fixing fiscal problems is growth. But growth is very difficult to achieve. But there is actually one win-win, one area where the green transition, the energy transition, can generate exactly that, growth. And I will hand over to Siddharth for this. Oh, you need this, I think.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm very excited to be presenting here at IIMA. And okay, so let me just recap where Franziska left off to start off with, right? So South Asian countries face a fiscal challenge, right? And as she was saying, one way, and indeed some would say the only way, real way, to address fiscal challenges in the long run is to get growth going. And one way to get growth going is to become more energy efficient. So this is what I will be talking about in the rest of this presentation. So how can we spur investment in energy efficient technologies? So the good news is that South Asian countries have reduced their energy intensity of output. So if you look at this chart here, the red bars that are dropping down, they show that South Asia's energy intensity is declining. So energy intensity of output is energy used per unit GDP. Right? Now, this is quite remarkable, right? This decline in energy intensity, and good news. So we wanted to understand what's behind this. And to understand it better, we looked at firm level data. So we looked at data from the world's enterprise surveys, and these enterprise surveys were conducted in more than 40 emerging market and developing economies, including India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, and they surveyed more than 70,000 firms between 2006 and 2022. Our other source of data was India's annual survey for industries, ASI. As some of you might know, it's a factory level survey, and the ASI also tracks factories over time. So we use ASI data on more than 150,000 plants over 2001 and 2018. And what do we find? So what's behind this decline in energy intensity in South Asia is a decline in firm level energy intensity within sectors. So firms within sectors, within industries are reducing their energy intensity. And on average, firm level energy intensity in South Asia fell by about 3% per annum between 2006 and 2022. And that's really remarkable, right? When you look at other emerging markets and developing economies, EMDs, that decline is actually slower, it's 2%. So while this news is good, this decline has not been fast enough to really offset the fact that South Asia itself is growing and GDP is growing. And as a result, total energy consumption in South Asia is still increasing. And you see that in these yellow diamonds here. Also, even though energy intensity is falling, the fact is that South Asia is still an energy intensive region overall. This chart here shows that overall energy intensity of output in South Asia is still about twice the global average. And in these two largest economies, India and Pakistan, its energy intensity is about a quarter to 1/3 higher than in other EMDs. So there is room to improve energy intensity, right? And how do we get there? Right? So before I move to the next slide, can I request you to look up? And what do you see? Something? Lights. Okay, good. LED lights, right? So one way to get energy intensity to go down is to start adopting energy efficient technologies like LED lights. Now, as far as I can tell, there are some LED lights here, and maybe not all of them. So, okay. So how do you get to adopt these energy efficient technologies? So we looked at data from the World Bank's firm level adoption of technology surveys, which were recently conducted in 7 EMDs, including India and Bangladesh. And what did we find? As this chart shows here, South Asian firms are actually enthusiastic adopters of basic energy efficient technologies like LED lights. So the rate here is quite high in South Asia. It's really remarkable. But when it comes to more advanced energy efficient technologies like programmable thermostats or high efficiency heating and cooling systems, they are still behind other EMDs. So there is a lot of scope to catch up when it comes to more advanced energy efficient technologies. There are also differences in adoption rates of these technologies across firms. So this chart here is based on a regression where we look at, okay, what are the determinants of an overall index of energy efficiency in firms. So this is the technology index of energy efficiency, right? And what do we find? We find that larger firms are more likely to adopt these technologies. They have a higher index level. So here, compared to firms with less than 20 employees, firms with 20 to 100 have a higher rate. Firms with 100+ employees are even more efficient, right, in terms of this adoption of technology index. Right? Firms with a more educated manager are more likely to adopt these technologies. And firms that use more sophisticated management techniques, like tracking key performance indicators or KPI, are also more likely to use technology, energy efficient technologies. So keep in mind that we are looking at a large spectrum of firms, really small ones, really large ones, and there are wide differences in their management quality and managerial practices, right? Something that will resonate here. So, okay. So technology adoption matters, right? And how do you increase that? So one factor that's constraining the adoption of these technologies is the fact that firms underestimate how much energy they can save, how much they can gain from adopting them. And they lack access to accurate information on them. So I'm going to talk very quickly about a very exciting experiment that we are doing with firms in the leather goods sector in Bangladesh. This is in collaboration with researchers at Columbia and Johns Hopkins. And what we found was that in this sector, in the leather goods sector in Bangladesh, but also in India and other countries, right, there is a more energy efficient motor that's available in the market. And it's clearly more efficient and makes sense than what already exists in the market, but its adoption rate is quite low. And what we did was to give firms information, very accurate information on how much they can save by adopting this motor and how they can switch to it. Right? So that's the experiment we're doing with firms. And what do we find? We find that before given this information, right, at the baseline, firms do underestimate how much they can gain from this new technology. So this chart here shows that switching to the new motor will reduce energy use in their stitching machines by about 80%. That's huge. What firms think they can save by switching is only 30%. Right? And not surprisingly, because of that underestimation, their actual willingness to pay for this new technology, we found, is about half the actual market price. So they don't understand the value of this technology, essentially. So the thrilling thing is that when we give firms information, things seem to change. 3 months after giving them information, adoption rate had gone up to 10%. Right? And interestingly, even firms that were not given information directly from us, right, they seem to have heard about it from other firms that they know. And so word was spreading. And we found that adoption rates are going up even in firms not directly given information by us. Right? So this has important implications for governments which are cash strapped and are finding and need to find ways to spur the adoption of these technologies. You can design these low-cost informational interventions and also use the fact that word spreads across firms sometimes. Now, coming back to what are the other factors that prevent the adoption of these technologies? One thing we found is that in South Asia especially, right, it's just the reliability of grid electricity. And how does it matter? So as you see in this chart here, it's quite notable that the rate at which firms in South Asia use backup diesel generators. And so these diesel generators are wasteful and they're polluting. But their rate of use is really high in South Asia. And when we look at data from the World Bank's firm level adoption technology surveys, what we find is that a lot of firms have experienced a power outage in the past month. So about 30% firms report experiencing a power outage. And in a regression, we find that firms that have reported experiencing a power outage in the past month are significantly more likely to be using backup generators. So this suggests that one reason for the use of these wasteful technologies is just that the grid is unreliable. Another factor is that we are not getting incentives right. So South Asian countries still spend about more than 1.5% of their GDP on subsidizing fossil fuel produced energy. And this obviously distorts incentives, right? Why would you adopt a more efficient technology when you're not really paying the full price for energy, for fossil fuel energy? And indeed, in Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, the price of electricity and energy is so low that it has been estimated that the effective price of carbon per unit is negative. Right? And if you take into account the social cost from emissions, the effective price of carbon should be much higher than that. It should certainly not be negative. So this is another issue here. Right? So what else can governments do to spur investment in these technologies? We did a systematic review of the literature on energy efficient technology adoption, about 47 peer-reviewed studies, and this is what we found. One thing that really matters is environmental regulation, especially regulations that use market-based principles like cap and trade schemes. So indeed in India, in Gujarat, I don't know if you've heard about it, but in Gujarat there is an ongoing experiment, a pilot experiment with firms in the manufacturing sector where they've introduced a cap and trade scheme. So they give firms targets for their emissions of PM2.5 or particulate matter, and they allow firms to trade if they emit less than they need to, right? So, and randomized evaluation has found that this scheme, this market-based environmental regulation scheme, has actually been very effective at cutting pollution and also been very cost-effective. So, market-based regulations are important. Right? But even the more traditional command and control regulations sometimes seem to work. Now, they tend to have more side effects because they are less flexible, but sometimes they can work. And again, a classic example here, which has been studied, is India's court-mandated pollution action plans, which were introduced in 17 cities about 30 years ago or so. And again, studies have found that they were effective at cutting pollution. Yeah. So regulation, right? Especially market-based regulation. The second factor we found is information. I already discussed our experiment in Bangladesh, which was about information. So information does seem to have an effect. It's cost-effective, but it has smaller impacts than regulation. The third thing that really stands out is financing. So firms often complain that access to finance is the problem when it comes to adopting a new technology. Right? This is not surprising because most new technologies, energy efficient ones also, have a high upfront cost and their benefits play out over time. Right? So if you're credit constrained, it's difficult. So in the literature, we find that yes, there is hints that it really has an effect. Access to credit, giving firms credit, has an effect. But the evidence is still a bit nascent, and it's promising. So regulation, information, financing, right, to emphasize. Now, I want to come back to something Franziska alluded to in the beginning, which is that the adoption of energy efficient technologies, increasing energy efficiency, isn't just going to increase productivity, but it will also cut down pollution and create jobs. So as you see in the chart here, the power sector and energy use in the industrial sector contributes more than 50% to South Asia's particulate matter emissions. And air pollution, as you know, is a huge problem here. Right? So there's one area in which energy efficiency can help. Second, we found that when you compare sectors that had above median cuts in energy intensity with those that were below median, right? It's the sectors that had a faster cut in energy intensity that saw faster increase in employment. And this suggests that when firms become more energy efficient, they channel those savings into creating jobs. Right? So these are these many benefits of energy efficiency. Now these jobs that could be created will be needed because there will be people looking for new jobs as this energy transition gets underway. And this brings me to the final question that we ask in this report. How will the energy transition shape labor markets? Right? So, what's going to happen is that as the energy transition gets underway, right, the demand for green jobs will increase and the demand for pollution-intensive jobs will fall. And so people who work in pollution-intensive jobs will slowly have to transition out. Now, the fact is, when we looked at data from labor force surveys and tried to get numbers on pollution-intensive and green jobs, the fact is that in most South Asian countries, pollution-intensive jobs outnumber green jobs. India is the only exception. So in this chart you see here, in most countries in South Asia, more than 10% of jobs are pollution-intensive, and the share of green jobs is lower. Only India is an exception. Now, just to step back again and tell you what these green jobs or pollution-intensive jobs are, it's hard to measure them. Right? But there is increasing consensus on how to do it, and it involves looking at the occupational content of each job. And essentially, a green job is a job involving an occupation that is environmental friendly. So it could be environmental protection, it could be working in the renewable energy industry, but it could also be things like repair and recycling. Pollution-intensive jobs are those involving occupations which are very common in heavily polluting industries. So one example is a worker in the textile industry, because the textile industry is very polluting. And machinery workers, these are pollution-intensive jobs. Now, just note that most jobs are not green and they're not pollution-intensive. So, let me step back. Right? So the vast majority of jobs are neutral jobs. So I just said that pollution-intensive jobs outnumber green jobs in South Asia. Now, the interesting fact is that pollution-intensive jobs tend to be concentrated in manufacturing. You see this in this chart here, where the red bars are the share of manufacturing in pollution-intensive jobs. More than 50% of pollution-intensive jobs in most countries in South Asia are in the manufacturing sector. In contrast, green jobs tend to be more spread out across sectors. You'll find them in, not just in manufacturing, but in agriculture, in services, and so on. So there's scope for green jobs across the economy. They also differ in the type of worker, right? So we look at labor force survey data to try to understand the characteristics of workers in green jobs and pollution-intensive jobs. What we find here is that workers in green jobs are more educated than other workers. They are more likely to have a secondary or tertiary degree, less informal. Workers in pollution-intensive jobs, in contrast, are less educated than other workers. They are less likely to have a secondary or tertiary degree and more likely to be informal. Green jobs, not surprisingly then, are associated with higher wages, 30% higher wages. Part of that is because they have more educated workers. But even after you adjust for education, there is still a wage premium of about 7% in green jobs. Pollution-intensive jobs pay less than other jobs. So these are very different types of workers in different types of jobs. They also differ in how they are located, right? So essentially, in a nutshell, you see here in this map, pollution-intensive jobs are more concentrated in places than green jobs. So overall, in South Asia, there are only 4 subnational zones where green jobs account for more than 10% of all jobs. In contrast, there are more than 8 areas, including some states in India, where pollution-intensive jobs account for more than 10% of jobs. So what this means is that not only are less educated workers in pollution-intensive jobs more vulnerable as the green transition gets underway, but also certain places which are heavily invested in pollution-intensive jobs, which are vulnerable. Right? So what does this mean for the future, and how can policy help? So we saw the current picture, but that can only help so much in understanding this, right? So to better understand this question, we again did a review of the literature on what is the closest counterpart to this, which is resource booms and busts. Right? What we find in the literature is that resource booms are associated with increase in employment and increase in earnings. Right? But these tend to be short term. So resource busts, on the other hand, are associated with long-lasting cuts in employment and earnings. So really, there is this threat to workers and certain areas in this green transition. That's what we learned from historical experience. And what policy needs to do is to facilitate this green transition, right, while taking care of the workers. So general policies for job creation are important. The more jobs there are, the easier it will be to find jobs. Second, to facilitate the transition out of pollution-intensive jobs, skilling is important. Helping migration is also important. At the same time, social protection policy can help scarring effects on workers during the transition. Finally, regional policy, given that there are certain pollution-intensive regions, so to speak, right? So policies that look at these regions, that involve infrastructure investment, strengthening institutions can help. So I'll end here. We looked at 4 questions in this report. The economic outlook, as we said, is one of solid growth, but with downside risks. There are persistent challenges from weak private investment, low revenues, and administrative controls, the trade barriers and capital controls that Francisca spoke of. How to address fiscal risks? Well, conditions are ripe for debt default in some countries. Right? And debt restructuring, growth boosting reforms, stronger revenue collection rules can help facilitate success. How to spur investment in energy efficient technologies, that's one of the win-win solutions here. And right now, energy intensity in South Asia is still very high compared to global averages. Firms lag in adopting advanced technologies, energy efficient technologies, and regulation, financing, and information can help. And it's also important to think about how the energy transition will shape labor markets, and to think about how to smooth this transition from pollution intensive jobs to green jobs. And policies need to boost jobs to help workers and regions adjust. I'll stop here. These are the chapters in our report which we were just discussing, and I really strongly encourage you to read our report, to download it. There's a QR code here, And so with that, I'll stop. Thank you so much for listening to us.
So thank you, Siddharth and Francisca, for a very interesting and enlightening presentation. I would like to start the Q&A session with, by inviting PGPX representatives, Parth and Gopi, who will convey a few questions from the PGPX batch. After that, we'll open it up to the audience. Parth.
So good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. So first of all, I would like to start by thank you for this insightful presentation. I really liked it. So actually, some of us went through the report before the session, and we had a few questions. So I would like to put forward those questions to you on their behalf. So the first question is from Parth. So as you said, China has been experiencing an economic slowdown. So how is this economic slowdown affecting the countries in the region, and what steps can they take to insulate themselves better from such external shocks?
That's a good question. You know, every country in the world is asking themselves that question. So in our scenario, we did the scenario with a very standard macro model, this Oxford economics model, that a lot of the central banks use. And you find that this 2 percentage point lower growth in China will reduce, it's like a 4-to-1 effect. It'll reduce growth in the region by 0.5 percentage point. And really all the countries in the region, we don't estimate it by country, but they're not that different. They would probably all be affected. What will increase the impact is the vulnerabilities they have. So countries that have more foreign reserves, like India, will be easier, more able to withstand it. Countries that are completely out of reserves, no names, will find it much harder to withstand this growth slowdown. So the immediate impact is probably the same across all the countries in the region. None of them are very much integrated, and that goes back to the import and export restrictions. The question is how much room for policy is there to buffer this? And that's where the impact will differ. So it's the second round, how lasting that impact from the China slowdown is. That will differ across the countries. What should countries do? Really build buffers. The solution is not to put all these import and export restrictions, because that is a long-term damage to investment, long-term damage to productivity growth, long-term damage to growth. The solution is to build buffers that allow countries then to respond to these external shocks. So there's still room for the technology and the foreign dynamism to come in when it's good, but policy to respond when it's not good.
Thank you. So the next two questions are from Vibhuti Ratan Shah. So his first question is, while many analysts are optimistic about South Asia's economic growth, however, they believe that the growth is mostly jobless in nature. So do you believe that South Asia's service sector-led jobless growth might lead the region into a middle income trap?
Another $1 million question, and we are working on it. This will actually be the subject of the next April report. So there is a sense that growth is jobless. I can give you some preliminary findings from this. It is and it isn't. It isn't in the sense that it's no more jobless than anywhere else. This region has actually created more employment. It's had bigger employment growth than most other regions. It's also this elasticity from growth to employment, at least by our preliminary results, is no different in this region from others, no worse. What is different to other regions is working age population growth. So the region is creating a lot of jobs, but is creating more people. That's the issue. There is a lot of working age population growth that's looking for jobs. And that's where the jobs, relative to this, job creation is slow, not relative to aggregate output growth. But more to come in April.
Second question from Vibhuti is, are the recurring instances of economic default in Pakistan and other countries a pertinent issue? How can South Asian countries break free from their reliance on the bailouts that they get?
Yeah. So that's exactly why we wrote this piece. That's why we were asked to write this piece on how to make debt default a success. Because most debt, or a good share of debt defaults isn't a success, no? Somewhere between a third and a half. So the question is, will the countries that are currently in default, and it's not just in this region, will they end up in the third that fails, or will they end up in the 2/3 that succeed in improving fiscal positions? And I wish I had shown it actually. That's why we have these regressions, these selection bias corrected regressions on what is associated with a bigger government debt reduction, with a bigger borrowing cost reduction after default, conditional on default. And those are three things. Growth really is the silver bullet. But growth will likely not be enough with the kind of revenue ratios here. This is where the region really stands out. The Sri Lankas, 10% of GDP. Pakistan too has a debt to revenue ratio that's much lower than India's even, somewhere between 10 and 20%. It's hard to run a government on these revenue ratios. And even harder to pay back debt. So it will probably need revenue increases. And in every country, these are politically much more contentious. Well, these are contentious, politically contentious, perhaps more contentious than spending cuts. Spending cuts is easy to do, you just don't give the spending order. And this is usually for capital investment. Revenue increases are very politically difficult to achieve. And they usually come down to two things. Better administration, i.e. tax inspectors going after taxpayers in a way that benefits not themselves, but the treasury. That's component one. Component two is closing loopholes, reducing exemptions, reducing thresholds. Usually thresholds to the revenue reporting, introducing presumptive taxes. A lot of small enterprises, especially in the formal sector, it's just not worth filing a tax return. They're so unproductive. Their productivity is so much lower than a formal firm. It's the administrative cost of trying to do a proper tax return and enforcing it is just too high. So what countries do is a presumptive tax. They just say, your revenues are this much, you give us a share, this is what we assume are your profits, based on some average, and we tax this share of profits. That's usually a thing to do. It hurts politically, it's difficult to do. Yeah.
Thank you. And the next question is from Par, that's again me. So, financial systems in several countries in South Asia are fragile, as all of us saw in the presentation. So, could you shed some light on the risks associated with such fragile financial systems and the measures that can be taken?
Yeah, actually what we point out in the report is that the financial systems, at least by the traditional indicators, seem okay now. Non-performing loans in most countries are actually okay, well within the ratios. The problem with non-performing loan ratios, of course, they take you 2 years to respond to real distress. No, there's such a lagging indicator, it's hard to tell. One of the biggest vulnerabilities in the financial sectors here, especially in the countries that are now in debt distress, is their exposure to the sovereign. So you get this feedback loop between the sovereign and the private banks. So, for example, I think in Sri Lanka and Pakistan, 2/3 of the banking system is heavily exposed. 2/3 of banking system assets are government debt. If government debt is in distress, you immediately have the impact on the financial sector. So, financial systems, we haven't looked at this in detail in this particular edition, but they must be struggling with weak sovereigns and at the same time weak investment growth. It seems like the private sector doesn't want to invest. There aren't that many projects to invest in, and that probably isn't felt also on the financial sector side. It must be hard currently to run a bank.
Thank you so much. I'm going to hand over the mic.
Thanks, Parth. We have a couple of questions on the climate change theme. So in the presentation you shared some of the adverse impacts of climate change on the South Asian region economies. So given this scenario, could you provide some insights on the challenges and opportunities available to the South Asian region countries? So that's part one. The part two is also if you can elaborate on the adaptation and mitigation strategies that are under consideration from the perspective of a World Bank economist.
Thank you. Yeah, it's working? Yeah. Thank you. Really interesting question. And I think they're both kind of the same question, so maybe I'll answer them together, right? So South Asia is one of the regions in the world that is most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Right? The warming, the changes in precipitation, but also the extreme weather events, right? Cyclones, floods. So, and the economic damage from this climate change has been estimated to be quite large. So what's really important is to think about how to prepare for this and to adapt to climate change. Right? We didn't speak about that very much in this version of the report, but it's very much a topic we are working on. And we will have a lot more on that in our next few reports. But just to sort of give you some sense of what's coming and what we are thinking about. Right? So the region is underprepared for climate change. So while we are making investments to increase resilience to climate change, like building more flood-resistant roads, right? It is still underprepared. And a lot of how to prepare for climate change has to do with how households, farmers, and firms are able to adapt to climate change, and what public policy can do to facilitate that adoption, and what public policy can do in terms of public investments to facilitate this adoption, adaptation, sorry. So what do we mean by adaptation to climate change? There are things that households, firms, and farmers can do to become more resilient to extreme weather. So firms, for example, can diversify their supply chains because a lot of the risks come from their suppliers. They can diversify their markets. They can adopt more resilient technologies, start making products that are more suited for a changed climate, right? So they can innovate. So these are just some of the ways in which firms can adapt to climate change. Households can build more resilient homes, right? But they can also migrate to other places where there are more opportunities. So one of the ways in which climate change will play out is it will not affect every place the same way. So migration is going to play a big role in adapting to it. Farmers, so the agricultural sector is the sector that is going to face the brunt of climate change, right? As you can imagine. So there's a lot that can be done in that sector. Some of it has to do with what is called more sort of resilient, or there are different terms for it. Climate smart agriculture. But essentially what it means is that you can start planting crops that are more weather resistant, that are more drought resistant. Depending on the risk you face where you live, you can sort of change your crop to that. Right? So these are some of the channels through which adaptation is going to have to happen. And then there are public investments. There is only so much that households and firms and farmers can do. At the end of the day, governments have to step in and fill in the gaps. Right? So, for example, building a more flood-resistant road, something I alluded to, it's a public investment. Migration, we know there are barriers to it. It requires maybe some policy reforms or something to facilitate that. Right? So we need to think about how public policy can complement private action and fill in the gaps. And this is a huge agenda.
I just want to emphasize what Siddharth says. If you link this agenda, this adaptation, with the fiscal challenges here, the policy reforms that Siddharth mentions are really critical. Governments have no money here. They'll soon have outspent their public investment. So we hope that these roads, remember that chart on public investment, we hope that it's resilient roads. There's no money left after this. No? So that doesn't mean that governments cannot do anything. It means that governments need to do other things. For example, this farmers' migration that Siddharth mentioned, it requires them to be able to move. It requires them to be able to sell their land. That requires a registry of land. That requires proper titles. That requires proper maps. That requires a bank loan to buy for someone else to buy the land. So there are many reforms that governments can do, even if they have no money, to just unblock the system. Do a digital registry. Do a proper map. Draw a proper map that comes with the registry. Make sure that banks are sound so they can give those mortgages to people who are trying to buy the land. There are many things governments can do, even if they have no money.
No, thank you. Before I move to the next question, I'll give the due credit to Parth because the previous question was from Parth also. So the last question is from Sunil. So the question is, how can developed countries take accountability of climate disasters in developing countries? Does carbon makers help in this regard? Sorry, markets, carbon markets.
Yes. So the big question is, how do you find the most cost-effective and the most impactful ways to respond to climate change, right? And I was just in my presentation, we talking about one such way, which is energy-efficient technology adoption, right? This is a kind of a win-win here, right? And it may be that the best opportunities to advance in this are in a place like Bangladesh, where we find that there is a very clear, better technology, servo motors available, and it's not being adopted, right? And there is scope to increase this adoption, right? So there must be many such cost-effective ways to respond to climate change, but not just climate change, to pollution, right? This is a huge issue in this region. So we also spoke about regulation, market-based regulation. And that's exactly what a carbon market is. It's a mechanism, any market-based regulation is a mechanism to meet your environmental objectives in a cost-effective, flexible way. It doesn't force everyone to behave the same way. It channels funds to the firm or the region which has the best opportunities. So these market-based initiatives, whether they are global or local, are going to be really important. And we need to think about how to make them work, what institutions they will need.
And there are easier ways. Carbon markets is the perfect way of the economically efficient way of getting the price of carbon right. But the subsidy, remember the chart that Siddharth showed you on the price of carbon is negative in a lot of these countries. Just fixing the subsidies, removing the things that encourage waste, like free tariffs for things, free water, free electricity, free fertilizer. Those use a lot of carbon. No? It's fiscally better to remove those subsidies, and it's better for efficiency, for productivity. So the carbon market is the ideal thing, but difficult. There are markets. So for example, if you are interested in supporting climate change, you can buy a carbon bond. There are countries that sell these, but it needs to be accredited, and that's extremely expensive and difficult to do. So many countries who would love to do more of it can't do it because they can't get the accreditation. It requires capacity building in a lot of countries. So first step can be the simpler things.
Thank you to our speakers, and we are already beyond time, but we'll maybe take one or two questions from the audience. Yes, Mike.
Hi, Siddharth. Basically, this is a question for you. So, in the map that you showed, right, one of the places, dark places in polluting industries was Alang, the shipbreaking yard, right? And if I see it, the choice for South Asia, right, one of the three major points of shipbreaking industries are Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. So, the choice for countries like us, which have a huge population, which is which works at bottom of the wages, and so the choice is choice for a regulator, for a administrator, is that whether that fellow gets the meal next week, next month, or whether they get a unhealthier life a decade down the line. So in a way, as Indian regulations have increased, if you look the pattern in Alang, the industry has moved from Alang to Pakistan and Bangladesh. So, and that is as a citizen, it is a heartbreaking trade-off, but that is what it is. So, so what would you advise if, and this is a conversation I had with a friend of mine who is working with Government of India, and that was the trade-off. So how would you advise Government of India, or how would you advise the policymaker?
Look, this is a difficult question, and it's so as we emphasize in our report, and thing to keep in mind is that a lot of this pollution has effects on your health and productivity. So not responding to it will also ultimately have a cost in terms of jobs. And so what we need to think about is how to ease this transition in the labor market. And there's a lot that can be done here. So if you think about the shipbuilding example you gave, there are many examples like that all over the region and in the world, right? So we know that absent some policy to think about this transition, there can be long-lasting impacts. We know that from historical experience. So what policymakers need to do is to think about this transition. First of all, policies for general job creation are important, right? So that there are more jobs elsewhere for these workers to find. And that's about growth, right? And second, you need to think about the right skills in the market, education, basic education, but also job-specific skills. And a lot of the constraint to this transition happens because people can't move to different regions. And I can get into many barriers to this kind of migration and how policy can make impact there. So that's also something that will really help in this transition. At the same time, social protection policies, safety nets can help prevent scarring effects on workers. So one of the things we need to worry about in these transitions is that you don't want a short-term shock to turn into some long-term issue, right? While they find new jobs. So you need to think about social protection policies during this transition. And then finally, there are some regional policies that are needed. So again, we know this from historical experience, that regions that are invested in certain types of industries that are being transitioned out of tend to face long-lasting slumps in employment. And what has worked in the past is well-targeted regional development policy, which could involve connective infrastructure, transport investments, but also institutional strengthening. So.
Good afternoon, sir. Here, this side. Yeah. Yeah. So thank you for such an insightful presentation. I have a question to Dr. Siddharth from your third question, like technological solutions and efficient technology, basically. So as you told that growth is keep the growth going. That's the only solution for South Asia and India in general. So specifically. When we talk about energy, what we mean is we need to switch to renewable energy resources. And in India, around 40% of energy resources are from renewable energy sources. But out of them, say 20% of them is from hydro power related. So that is also kind of, we can't even say it's completely renewable because methane emission and all those things. And when it comes to solar, we are using, technological advancements are going, but even say 2 decades back, we had semiconductor materials for solar panels, which used to be considered toxic because of lead. But due to policy push, we had to allow
Can I request you to ask the question?
Yeah, exactly, I'm coming to that. So do you see any ground level solutions for these technologies to actually improve, not just they are allowing because of policy push? Like earlier, they were not considered good for environment, but now we have to switch to renewable, so they are getting into the market. Thank you.
So, as we find in our report, right, what this requires is a combination of policy options. So, first of all, you need regulation, environmental regulation, to get the incentives right, and again, more flexible market-based regulations would work better because they would allow for more cost-effective solutions to this. Second thing is that, as you said, how to make these technologies actually work on the ground, right? So it's really a problem of adoption, and we know that even superior technologies have actually taken time to be adopted. So one example that comes up historically is that of steam energy. Now, I know that that's the opposite example now because this is the transition from water mills historically to steam energy, right? And at that point in time, back in history, steam energy was superior in many ways, right? But it took more than a century for it to be diffused fully in the West. And people have thought about this, what caused this? It was switching costs, information, all of these things. So even for renewable energies like solar energies, information is going to help, financing programs, credit, thinking about what prevents the technology that has been developed in the lab or in more ideal condition, what prevents it from working well in the field when it's actually being used. That's really important.
So we have time for one last question.
Okay. Yeah. Let me give it a shot. Welcome, Dr. Franziska and Dr. Siddharth to IIM Ahmedabad campus. So I have a question for Dr. Franziska, or rather 2 questions. One question, in a passing remark, you mentioned about we may see more defaults in Chinese economy and more bankruptcy filing in Chinese economy. So I'm very curious to learn, and I'm still learning Chinese economy. So that's what caught my attention. That was one. The second one was, what is the role of digital platforms on future economies in South Asia region? So these are my 2 questions for you, ma'am.
So Chinese default. So our assumption is that the real estate, it's a scenario, it's not the baseline, right? So in the baseline, the authorities come in to support and prevent any major default, so there's no big effect. But the assumption here is that the real estate sector really begins to suffer, and we see much more defaults. We didn't specify how many more. But just to give you a rule of thumb, the real estate sector in China is about a quarter of GDP. It's huge. So you don't need much distress to immediately have this 2% impact on GDP. but we didn't put any specific number on the defaults that lead us to this 2% slowdown. Mind you, the scenario is very extreme because it's a 2% growth rate is less than what China had in the pandemic. So it's really a very strong distress scenario that would then lead. Most of these models are linear though, so you can scale it up and down to what you think is plausible. On the digital platforms, there's great hopes pinned on this. And I guess South Asia is fairly well placed because there is so much diffusion of access to digital services already. But it requires, to really take off and make an impact on GDP growth, it requires many other things to be right that are perhaps right in South Asia, but perhaps not so right in other countries like Africa, where there's also great hopes pinned to digital platforms. And that it requires that the internet works, that the internet is affordable. Actually, the internet works and doesn't get shut off by power cuts. It really requires an electricity system that also works. It requires that access is affordable, which I believe in South Asia it is, but that's a different question in Africa, for example, where you have a lot of monopolies, so it's very expensive to be connected. And of course, it requires that the technology then also is dissipated, that the phones and the computers, etc., are distributed. Now, on digital platforms specifically, you mean the gig economy, right, or the job matching platforms? Yes. Yes. Yeah. So we are actually doing one study that tries to see what is the effect. Does the job matching platform improve the jobs that women find? Results are not in yet. But again, we will show them next October. That's when we plan to show them. But you certainly see it in the agricultural sector. In Africa, tractors, there's an Uber for tractors, basically. So you can order a tractor by Uber and it's increased productivity in the farmers who have signed up to the platform. So the big hopes that these kinds of things can reduce the capital investment that is necessary, and that's often unaffordable for small farmers. But by pooling these resources through these mobile platforms, you can actually really raise productivity. And that Uber for tractors is one of the prime examples.
Thank you. I think we're almost out of time now. So I'd like to thank our esteemed guests for a very enriching presentation. And so let's give a round of applause.